Hi, I'm Gary Noesner, and you're listening to the Crisis Cop podcast on the Two Guys Talking podcast network.
You likely know the word Waco, but what do you think when I say the name Gary Noesner? Well, Gary was there during Waco and many other incidents throughout his decades-long career in the FBI. Today on the Crisis Cop podcast, you're going to learn more about Gary Noesner. And welcome to the podcast, Gary Noesner. Gary, welcome.
Thanks. Good to be with you.
So, Gary, we kind of laid out a little bit of your what you're known for, your book, and then the series. But there's way a lot more that we're going to dive into on this podcast. So, why don't you give us a little bit of background and tell us a little bit about your career?
Well, I spent 30 years in the FBI, and I retired in 2003. 23 years of that was I was a negotiator and got into the specialty of negotiations fairly early in its existence. And in the FBI, for most negotiators, it's a part-time function, as it was for me. So I worked mostly terrorism cases in that time frame, and also responded to situations that were the FBI's, or I worked a lot with the Washington Metropolitan Police, and had a couple situations that I had an opportunity to demonstrate my skills, and eventually was asked to become one of the three full-time negotiators at the FBI Academy to instruct this around the nation and overseas. And we eventually got down to two people there. And by the time the infamous Waco situation rolled around in 1993, I was designated as the chief negotiator, and did that for the remaining 10 years of my career, working prison riots, hijackings, right-wing militia standoffs, religious zealot sieges, and about 120 kidnappings of American citizens abroad. So that's kind of the experience I bring to it. I think I've always enjoyed most being an instructor, and having that operational experience ongoing as I was teaching, gave me a lot of good stories and lessons learned to share with audiences. And from the FBI's position of being a significant provider of training for law enforcement around the United States and abroad, was able to spread those lessons, and at the same time also get information from those who were experiencing negotiation situations on their own. And anyway, putting it all together and helping move the profession forward.
And so let's talk about training. So your initial training, you kind of had some notable instructors. You want to tell us a little bit about that, and kind of
Yeah,
what was your initial training like?
Negotiations was started by NYPD, I think, in '73. The FBI quickly realized it was a good program, and we copied it and began to spread it around the country and abroad. Um, and I went through my training in 1980, and it was a little bit interesting at the time that the FBI had two different sections that were providing the training. The first training I went through was from behavioral profilers. Um, John Douglas and Bob Ressler, who well known and famous in
Right.
the profiling business. John remains a friend of mine today, and someone I greatly admire. So their class was only a week, and then I went back to the Special Operations and Research Unit that had a 2-week course. So I went through both courses in fairly short order. Um, and back in those days, I should note that based on the New York model, it was primarily a bargaining
Right.
tool. It was, say, instead of just charging you with guns blazing, let's set up a perimeter, let's open a dialogue, let's make these guys work for everything they get, and eventually they'll get worn out, hostages might escape, they may fall asleep, who knows, and when I look back at my note-taking guide, the very first words on that were stall for time,
Right.
because of all the advantages that time typically brings us. And that's ended up being in essence, the title of my book that I wrote years later.
So I think it's important to have mentors in this field. And I was lucky enough to have a couple mentors that helped me through this. Did you have any mentors that kind of helped you, or people you kind of looked up to in the field when you were just kind of getting your
Sure.
feet wet?
Well, I mentioned John Douglas. I mean, I was a little bit closer to him than I was Bob Ressler, but my biggest mentor was Fred Lansley, who was one of the negotiation instructors at the Special Operations and Research Unit when I got there. And I thought Fred was kind of ahead of his time in terms of thinking about some of these things in a complex way and finding some of the most effective approaches to make negotiations more successful. So I think he had a huge impact on me. Back in 1990, when I became a full-time negotiator, I was a guest lecturer at the Canadian Police College and met Dr. Mike Webster, who at that time was really effectively teaching active listening skills. We had it in the FBI curriculum, but it was a very small part of our curriculum, and we didn't really emphasize it. And then when I heard Mike really explain it and teach it to students in such an effective manner, I began to have him come to all of our courses, and he had a big impact on me. And we subsequently front loaded that and made it the centerpiece of the FBI's negotiation training. And at that time, nobody else was really doing it. And I think it's had a profound, maybe the most profound impact on the crisis negotiation business since its founding. It really equipped negotiators with, very clear skills that they could learn and practice and utilize in a wide range of situations. And I think it's had a huge impact. Back in 1990, if you had gone to one of the few national negotiation conferences we had then, and you were to ask, does anybody know what active listening skill is? You'd be lucky to get any hands raised at all. And of
Right.
course, now, as you know, it's the bread and butter.
Right.
I don't know that anybody could really call themselves a negotiator if they didn't have some level of proficiency in active listening skills. So I think that's the biggest move and maybe the biggest contribution I had, influenced by others that that I leave behind as sort of a legacy.
Obviously, Waco is a big incident. Want to
Yeah.
talk a little bit about that, but some other incidents maybe that aren't as big, but you learned some valuable lessons from. If you want to share some of that stuff.
Well, there were so many. I mean, I worked in the '80s, even before I became a full-time negotiator. I flew to Raleigh, North Carolina for a 72-hour siege on an Amtrak train and helped negotiate a resolution to that. Unfortunately, a woman was killed before the train stopped in Raleigh and negotiations were begun, and a young child died in the case. At the time, it was the longest situation outside of a prison in the history of the United States. Very, very challenging with the language issues. We had to communicate almost through a loudspeaker system, but eventually we were able to deal with that. I talk about it in my book, Stalling for Time, and I was coaching a great negotiator, Ray Aris, who was able, in the Spanish language, to convince this fellow to surrender peacefully. So that one, I worked another famous case in the FBI in Sperryville, Virginia, where a man was holding his former common law wife and child, and we found him in a remote country home and negotiated with him for a day and a half, and eventually had to lure him out of the house where an FBI marksman took his life to save the woman and child. It's the first chapter in my book, and it's a bit odd to have a book about negotiations, and yet there we used it in support of a tactical resolution.
Right.
But I've also, always told negotiators that, we are going to be successful in achieving a peaceful outcome a very high percentage of the time, probably low to mid 80s, low to mid 90s percentile. But, you know, the outcome is determined by the perpetrator and whether they
Right.
make reasonable decisions or not. And if they don't, if we have to sort of migrate into supporting the tactical team, then that's not a failure of negotiation. It's a failure of the perpetrator to make the right decision. And that's our job. And so that case illustrates that. But there was a bunch of cases. I had a unique opportunity to work, prison riots and so forth. All of those had, significant impact on my thinking and my approach.
So going back to Waco, there's a lot of misconceptions. I always hear a lot of
Yeah.
people talk about how, oh, negotiations failed, it didn't work, blah blah blah. So what would be something you would want to put out there to kind of counter some of these misconceptions and maybe really talk about what happened there and what were the positives, because there were some, and then at the end, what really kind of drove it to where it went.
Yeah, Waco's the thing I'm the most proud of in the FBI because the great work the negotiation team that I led did. And it's also the thing that's the most troubling and disappointing from an organizational point of view. Before I get into Waco, let me make one comment, and you used it there, and I'm not criticizing that. We hear this a lot as negotiators. When the situation has to go tactical, um, police chiefs and sheriffs, special agents in charge, will often stand in front of the news media and say, negotiations failed, so we had to go in.
Right.
And that has always not sat well with me because I don't believe negotiations ever fail. We are buying time. We are slowing the situation down, allowing additional resources to arrive. We're allowing more intelligence to be collected from friends, family members, floor plans from landlords, whatever it might be. We're allowing for hostages to be released. There's any number of things. Most importantly is when we're talking, we don't have to send an officer inside to expose themselves to high risk. So I wish chiefs and sheriffs and special agents in charge would jettison that unfortunate term. They should say our negotiators did a great job and did their best. However, the person, chose not to avail himself of that
Right.
situation. Um, so on Waco, I think the biggest misunderstanding is, I was only there the first half, where we got 35 people out, including 21 children. I'm quite proud of that. I'm disappointed that we didn't get more out. I was uh, dealing with an on-scene commander and a tactical commander that were very frustrated by the uh, duration of the incident, and David Koresh couldn't have been a more difficult perpetrator to deal
Right.
with.
Yeah.
Very manipulative, very unreliable, very self-serving, narcissistic. So pretty much the ultimate challenge. And because of that, he would often make representations that he didn't live up to. I'm going to do this, and then he wouldn't do it. As negotiators, we're not surprised by that. We expect that from individuals we're dealing with, and we don't overreact. I apologize for that noise. There's a ring thing on my house, and I can't turn it off.
No,
Um,
no worries.
yeah. Uh, we expect that behavior. So when a perpetrator says they're going to do something, then they don't do it, we tend to come back and confront them with that. I did this for you. I did that. I spoke to my boss. I was able to accomplish the following. And you said you were going to do this and you didn't do it. And that puts me in a bad situation. I'm trying to help you. We lay a guilt trip on them essentially to get them to change what they're going to do. So that's the approach we should have took. But managers were frustrated and they wanted to use simultaneously supporting negotiation contact, but also tactical maneuvers that were intended to put pressure on them to force them out. And as a negotiator, that is
Right.
inconsistent. We're
Right.
sending
Yeah.
mixed signals. And I often tell people more difficult negotiation was with my own leadership than it was with David Koresh. Now, these FBI officials at the scene that made these decisions, they were trying to accomplish a positive outcome just like we were, but they just they didn't see the inherent conflict with these two opposing viewpoints. I was replaced halfway through because I was viewed as an impediment to tactical action, and I was guilty as charged. I was. There's no doubt about that. Now, after Waco, we had independent investigations, we had congressional review. I testified before both the House and the Senate, along with others, and in essence, the findings were that the negotiators had it right, and that the tactical team and the on-scene management made some bad decisions. Now, you know, that led to, the officials on scene sort of took an early retirement. I ended up getting a promotion, and the unit was expanded. That's when we turned it to the crisis negotiation unit. Now I had 10 full-time negotiators under my on my team, and it really was a sort of the golden years of the FBI's negotiation program. So we learned so much, but there was a lot of positive things out of Waco. We developed position papers out there, negotiation position papers. We had very unique administrative processes for turning over the team and handing over, doing summaries and reports. And, there's a lot of good things working with our behavioral profilers. So it's a mixed bag. And, the public is often confused, though. For example, probably a negotiator like you would say, well, why did you guys play that sound music out there? And that's always the thing that's bothered me, because we didn't. The
Right.
negotiators didn't support it. Didn't.
Right.
It's never been in our FBI's protocol. We always have taught against what I call agitation or deprivation techniques. They're just counterproductive and they don't work. But because idle hands are the devil's workshop, some of the folks from the tactical team felt that they had to, do something to make something happen. And that's unfortunate. I used to like Harvey Schlossberg's comment. You know, just engage in dynamic inactivity
Right.
sometimes,
Yeah.
and I always loved that. And you mentioned mentors. I knew Harvey, but not nearly as well as I did Frank. Frank is certainly a mentor and just a gem of a person, and a true legend in this business. But yeah, so Waco had so many lessons, and the biggest one, you'll be surprised to hear this, Pat, is to do things the way we did before. People say
Hmm.
the FBI didn't know who you were dealing with. I said, yeah, we had a pretty good idea who David Koresh was, and
Right.
had a we the negotiators had a damn good idea about how to resolve it. And I think left to our normal approaches, we probably would have got everybody out. Certainly a great many more. But we departed from what we had done successfully. And we'd done the Atlanta and Oakdale prisons, the CSA compound. I mean, we had done all sorts of hostage situations prior to Waco, and had great success. And I think the best way to look at Waco was, that it's a tragic series of challenging mistakes. And with all that aside, I still blame David Koresh and always have. This is the guy that day in, day out, we
Right.
gave an opportunity to make the right decision and lead his people out, and made all kinds of concessions and representations to him to satisfy the demands and needs that he had. Yet at the end of the day, he just had to give up too much. I mean, he was the king, the lord and master over everyone, and dictated everything they did. And he would have had to give all that up. And he knew he was probably facing the death penalty in Texas because of the loss of life of the ATF agent. So it was just more than he could do, and he selfishly took his followers with him. That's the other thing. There's still a significant amount of people around the country that think the FBI say,
Right.
"Oh, we got tired after 51 days, so we just decided to kill him and start a fire." I mean, that's just so ridiculously stupid and without basis. Arson investigation and a whole range of things have clearly demonstrated that they started the fire. Now, they did that based on the FBI inserting tear gas. Don't get me wrong. I
Right.
mean, there is cause and effect, but the FBI didn't start the fires. And it's sad that a proud, great organization like the FBI just took a hit that it's probably still suffering from. Once you lose the public's confidence, it takes a lot to get it back. And as an organization, we suffered a lot because of that.
Right.
You know, so that's kind of Waco. I mean, I just add one other piece. You may want to talk about it separately, but 3 years later, we had an 85-day siege in Montana with the Freemen.
Right.
And this time, with a new director, Louis Free, he says, "Gary, I'm in no rush for this to end. Do it the right way." And
Yeah.
in that case, I didn't have to fight to get support. It was gladly and appropriately given. And of course, it ended well. 85 days cost some money, but there's no lawsuit, no reputational damage, and that's the way to do it. And it's we in law enforcement are human beings, and our leaders, um, I think, remain to this day the biggest challenge for most negotiation programs is making sure that your top decision makers understand our capabilities and what we do and why we do it.
Right.
And that still remains a challenge with many departments. I was recently in touch with a local department here in Virginia that was asking for my help, and I mean their boss came out of the you know Neanderthal age or something like that. They just had no idea whatsoever that you should try to talk to these people. It was all let's go get them, and you can get away with that, and that's all well and good for a long time, and then you hear a sad story about losing a SWAT officer, and you find out the details, and you say, well, that was an unnecessary entry. We could have
Right.
probably diffused this thing if given the time. So those are the tragedies we try to avoid.
Something that else that came out of Waco was the HOBUS system, and
Yeah,
unfortunately, even today, I don't think it gets enough press that it should. I don't think it has enough. I think more people should be using it. It should be utilized more, but still, in itself, it's something that good that came out of that. If you want to talk a little bit more about
yeah.
HOBUS
I
and
mean, it was basically we had a big internal critique after Waco, and Janet Reno, the Attorney General at the time, said, "Well, what are your statistics on dealing with these kind of groups?" And we go, "Statistics?
right,
What are those? And that started Hobus. We got the funding to start, and I developed the first questionnaire for it. And, for the first time, we were able to break down locations. Is this a trailer? Is this an office building? Is this a bank? What time of day we're doing these things? How long do they last? How many are hostage versus barricade versus suicide? What are the outcomes? All this stuff is very useful data. And I'm not sure how many incidents are available in Hobus now, but I know it's many thousands.
yeah,
And yeah, I was long overdue, and I think it's an important piece. And most importantly, it shows the efficacy of negotiations. I mean, we're resolving 90 something percent of the situations. And the other thing I think that comes out of that, and something we learned way back in the 90s, and the reason I went to active listening is that there's only a few situations, 10% or less, that are actually bona fide hostage situations.
right,
Quid pro quo bargaining. Give me this or I'll kill that person. I mean, we certainly have those, but they're pretty rare. And
right,
there's a lot of police negotiators who have never really worked one. Now, that doesn't mean there's not innocent victims being held, but unless there's a substantive demand, it's not technically a hostage situation. And so what we found is in 90% of the cases, roughly speaking, we were dealing with highly emotional uh, individuals who were dealing with loss of, job, loss of relationship, loss of self-esteem, whatever it might be, and they're basically in crisis. So that's why after Waco, when we formed a much larger unit, I named it the Crisis Negotiation Unit to reflect that negotiators are used in a far broader set
right.
of circumstances than just pure hostage situations. The name is fine. I mean, I even in my book I said, my life as an FBI hostage negotiator. That's become part of the vernacular, and that's fine. I
Right.
don't criticize that. But we really engage more in crisis than anything else.
So going back to some of these incidents, obviously some of these don't go the way we want them to go.
No,
And again, like you said, it's at the end of the day, and we always say the incident commander. At the end of the day, the incident commander is that person in that situation. They
yeah,
determine what we do. But
that's right.
how do you cope with how did you cope with some of these incidents that maybe didn't turn out as well? Because that's
Yeah. Well, I'll give you the kind of the representation I made to when we were dealing with a suicide situation. I would tell the primary negotiator, listen, we're well trained and sincerely trying to help this person, and we're going to do our very best to convince this person, to influence this person not to harm themselves or anybody else. But at the end of the day, it's not our decision. We can only, the old thing about bringing a horse to water, you can't make him drink. And we're going to do our best, but don't take ownership of the outcome. I taught a class of negotiators many, many years ago, and they had one guy that had dealt with quite a few suicides, and several people had killed themselves on it. And I said, I've heard a lot of cops brag about, well, I worked 100 of these cases and never lost anybody. And I always say, well, you're a lucky son of a gun because
Right.
if
Exactly.
you respond to enough of them, somebody's going to kill themselves, and it's not because you said or didn't say something. It's just they've made that choice. Most of them are ambivalent, which is part of them wants to live, part of them want to die, and that gives us the salesman's proverbial foot in the door where we can steer many of them, if not most, away from self-harm. But again, if you go to enough of these, somebody has made their decision and they're going to do it, and you shouldn't take ownership of that. And that's why I always feel as a negotiator, I'm always going to win, not because of the outcome, but because I know I'm going to give it my sincere and genuine effort, whether it's hostage, barricade, suicide, to get this thing resolved peacefully. If it doesn't, it's not because I failed to make the right effort or wasn't sincerely trying to achieve the appropriate ending. And I think if we approach it that way, we kind of free ourselves from the self-induced pressure, and performance anxiety that comes from that. If you're in the hot seat and you are so filled with concern that you're going to say the wrong thing or you're going to trigger some horrific outcome because of a misstated phrase, then you're just not going to be effective. You just need to go. It's kind of the serenity prayer is what I always say. You know what you can do and what you can't change, and you understand the
Right.
difference. And I think that's a good guide for negotiators in general. And the how many times have you, Pat, known a negotiator who's really great in training, and then they get in a real situation, they kind of freeze up,
Right. Yeah. They can't sit in
and
the hot seat.
yeah, they can't sit in the hot seat. They may be good on the situation boards or doing something else, but and most of that is because of fear of failure, and fear of saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing. And I've never felt that, and I try to teach negotiators not to. Just know that I'm going to give it my best, and any objective person who listens to this recording of the negotiations is going to say, Pat really tried his best to help this guy, and it's a
Right.
shame that this guy didn't follow that advice. But I think if you go into it with that, it enables you to come across as more natural and authentic and genuine, and thereby more successful.
Yeah. And that brings up a good point too, that because you're always a fear of what you're going to say, but there's also that thing of, it's not like Hollywood. You're not going to have that magic one liner that you
No,
throw out there and, oh man, that was it. Right. We, just being in this field for as long as both of us have, most of the times there's not that magic one liner. It's just
no,
the, the whole depth of the incident, and being that, again, it goes back to the act of listening. Are you
yeah,
really that good listener? Right.
correct, and you're absolutely right. And the other thing that gives us strength is we function in a team context. There are certainly those
Right.
situations where, particularly in smaller departments, where a negotiator may be out there by him or herself with one coach, and but in a lot of significant incidents, we're surrounded by a team of supporting negotiators. And there's great comfort in knowing that we are collectively using our skill, talent, and experiences to evaluate this behavior that we're witnessing and coming up with what we think is the best strategy to deal with it. And it doesn't mean we're all geniuses and we always get it right, but we are really looking at it in a way that it doesn't put the full burden on whoever's in the hot seat negotiating. You know, I mean, when we have a break in a call, I might say, Pat, what did you hear? What do you think?
Right.
And you might say, well, Gary, I think you're being a little too tough with the guy or whatever. And, you know, Mike, what do you hear? What do you think? And that's how we should work optimally. And that really enhances our chances of being successful.
Yeah, and that's important too, is that whole team concept. I think
Yeah.
another thing that kind of gets lost, and that some people have their misconception. Oh, I'm just the primary guy, and that's the main. No, there's so many other key
Yeah.
components, and every one of them just as important. You're the coach, the team leader, your
Yeah.
intel people.
I get asked a lot what television or Hollywood gets wrong about
Right,
negotiations,
everything.
and well, yeah, mostly just about everything. But
Yeah.
but this is the one big issue, and even the Waco series that I was heavily
Yeah. Right.
involved in. On screen they're showing Michael Shannon, the actor, playing me and one other negotiator at Waco. Well,
Right.
in reality, there's 10 to 12 negotiators per shift.
Right. Yeah.
And but Hollywood doesn't have the bandwidth for that complexity and
Right.
hiring actors and writing scripts and showing all that in the way that it is in real life. And they always want to highlight whoever the star of the show is. But
Right.
that's just the way it is, and you can't get that changed. But I think the public would probably have a better understanding of what we do if they saw, the teamwork engaged in it. It's not just one person shooting from the hip and
Right.
and winging it.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we've been at it for a little bit here, so we're going to go ahead and take a break. So we will be right back in a few minutes.
Thought about a career in voiceover? Need a great, cost-effective on-hold message for your organization or business? Don't know where to start? Check out The Voice Farm, your one-stop shop for voiceover needs. Check it out now by accessing The Voice Farm at voicefarmers.com and see what difference can be made with a company that is truly outside the box. From the Voice Box, voicefarmers.com. That's voicefarmers.com.
Wouldn't it be cool if your advertising could last forever? It can with perpetual advertising. Here's how it works. Unlike TV or radio ads, where every instance the ads are broadcast, they're only played once and lost forever. Perpetual advertising could have repeat exposure and replayability weeks, months, and even years after they're inserted in a podcast. So even if a podcast is a few years old, your ads will still be impactful to repeat listeners, as well as new listeners. This gives your advertising dollar the most bang for the buck. Find out more about perpetual advertising at twoguystalking.com/sponsors.
Have you got a cool voice? Do you like to act? Are you quick when it comes to thinking on your feet? Want to help propel the future of training crisis negotiators across the globe and foster the future of law enforcement? We need you. It doesn't matter what you look like. Doesn't matter where you're from. Doesn't matter what's on your plate. We want your voice to help us evolve the way that law enforcement interacts and succeeds when it comes to crisis negotiation. Ready to get started? Access BlueBaggersProject.com and start your role-playing voice adventure today. BlueBaggersProject.com. That's BlueBaggersProject.com.
All right, we're back to the Crisis Cop podcast. Joining us today is Gary Noesner. So, Gary, you had mentioned your book, Stalling for Time. Let's dive into that and tell us what it was like to get your book published, and how did you manage to fit all your 20-something years into that book, and how did you pick some of those stories?
Well, to answer your last question, I didn't fit nearly all of it in there. What happened is I had been retired for 5 years from the FBI. I was working as a consultant for a major international British consultancy. And through the years after I retired from the FBI, I'd had so many friends say, "You got to write a book. You had so many unique experiences, kind of unparalleled." And so I finally sat down with my friend Peter Bergen, who has written some books on terrorism and used to be a CNN analyst, one of the last people to interview Osama bin Laden, just a great guy. And he put me in touch with his agent, his literary agent. And, she asked, "Can you write?" And I said, I don't know. She said, "Well,
Right.
give me a sample chapter." And I gave him the Sperryville incident, which is the first chapter of my book, and they changed almost nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And then they said, "Well, let's see an outline of what else you would talk about." But eventually, a Random House, it gave me a big advance to write the book, and that was great. But the bad news is I had to write the book.
Right.
But they wanted 85,000 words, I believe, and I gave them 185,000. So there's a lot of cases and incidents that didn't get in the final book because, they say, well, the person that reads this kind of book wants a book of about this length, and
Right.
how many prison riots you want to talk about, I mean, why is this one different from another one? So a lot of those questions came into view. So there was a lot of stuff that didn't get in there, but I was fortunate that both through my international terrorism work, working hijackings overseas in the Middle East and so forth, and my negotiation work, and the two of those crossed paths a bit. I just had an opportunity to be involved in an awful lot of things. And I remember telling my wife when the final manuscript was done, I said, I don't know if anybody's going to believe this. And she said, why? I said, they're going to think, well, this guy's making stuff up. He didn't
Right.
do all this stuff. But, it was a really interesting career. And I worked with great people and had an opportunity to do some really fascinating cases. But, you pay a toll for that too. The family suffers, and
Right.
you go through challenging times. But yeah, I mean, I'm very proud of that, and so it got synthesized into my book. My book it's not an instructional book about negotiations. It's basically sort of the history of negotiations in a broad way, and then in each of the cases that I chose to profile, I try to bring out the lessons as to why we do it this way or that way.
Right.
And so it they obviously wanted it for a broader audience, but I think it also has benefit for negotiators.
And then that kind of spun off. So talk about how did the Waco series kind of start, and how did that develop?
Yeah, the book again sort of played a role there because the Dowdle brothers, who produced the 2018 Paramount Waco dramatic series 6-parter, read my book and made contact with me, and ended up, again, my book rights and my consultingship were retained for that dramatic series. And I was fortunate the great actor Michael Shannon, who's become a friend, played me and did a really super job. He wasn't trying to imitate me, but he was certainly, repeat or parroted the things I believe in about negotiations. I think he did that quite well. The series was really good in terms of reflecting, the candid view of what the FBI did right and wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And they got that from my book, and I stand by that. My criticism of the show was that they also used the book of David Thibodeau, one of the
Right.
survivors.
Yeah.
And I believe they were in touch with him long before me. And I think that sort of swayed their perspective to be a little too sympathetic to Koresh. And I talked to them about it and disagreed with it. And
Mm-hmm.
when you sell your book rights, you have input, but not control.
Right. Yeah.
So they made the movie that they thought was told the story right. And the criticism I've heard, not just my own but from others, was that they made Koresh more likable and sympathetic than he was in real life. So then that led to a 3-part Netflix documentary series, which is very, very good, I think, and I'm in that. And then they did a second season of the Waco dramatic series. They called it Waco, The Aftermath, and that was again Michael Shannon playing me. I think it's a 5-part
Mm-hmm.
miniseries. In that second season, again, he's playing Gary Noesner, but in essence, none of what is shown did I actually do. That's, again, I've had people say, well, I don't remember you being involved in that. I said, well, I wasn't, but
Right.
that's,
That's TV.
that's TV, and I'm surprised they didn't have me wearing a cape and flying through the sky. But yeah, I mean, there are things to learn from those shows, but you got to take it with a grain of salt, and I think whether you're talking about a complex situation like Waco or anything else, you got to do some significant reading to really get to
Right.
the facts. I mean, Hollywood. I'm not being overly critical of Hollywood, but they have certain things they have to do to make a television show or a
Right.
movie
Right.
commercially successful and marketable, and that requires some adjustment of reality.
Right.
So, but it was a wonderful experience, and I really such incredibly talented people involved in those projects. Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
So something I've been a part of since I want to say maybe 2015, 2016 is NICNA. And you
Yeah,
were pretty much one of the architects of getting that off the ground. Can you tell us a little about what it is and why
yeah.
you wanted to do something like that?
Well, what happened was, there when I first got into negotiations, I think there was still is an annual conference of negotiators in Baltimore.
Mhm.
There was one in Arkansas at the time, and that was about it. And all of a sudden, in the late '80s and so forth, these regional conferences were coming into their own, and and I'd spoke at just about all of them, and the question came up: do we need a national, association or collective of sorts? So I brought back the leaders of most of these conferences, and we had a special week in Quantico at the FBI Academy together. And I said, what can we do? Because the FBI played a pretty significant role in for providing instruction in
Right.
negotiations, still does, I think. But I said, what is it that we can do to enhance what you do? And the consensus was they didn't want to give up their regional autonomy because
Mhm.
for a national entity, because they said, if we do it, say, for example, in Texas or Florida or California, we now have network with other people in our area. We can share resources and training, and it just makes more sense to do it that way. And that sounded like a good thing to me. So I helped them get organized to start the National Council of Negotiation Associations. So every year, representatives from each of the, I think it's like 20 or
20
25,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, get together and share ideas. Who was a good speaker at your conference that we could get at ours? What are some of uh, the interesting cases, and what are the lessons learned, and so forth. And I wrote the original guidelines, the National Council of Negotiation Associations guidelines that are now pretty much used. I think they've made some modifications from the original a little bit, but it basically tells the department these are the things that you need to be able to do to have a viable negotiation program, the training you need, the role you should play, and none of it's mandatory. It's just a recommendation for guidelines to follow, and I think they're pretty powerful, Pat, because if there's a lawsuit, and there are occasionally,
Right.
because outcomes don't always end the way we want, and a department is egregiously faulted for its decision making, its actions, I think increasingly you're going to find, attorneys saying, "Hey, you've got these guidelines, and it seems like you didn't follow any of them." You
Right.
know, and
Right.
I think any department out there needs to think, you know, uh, a good deal about are they following nationally embraced approaches and concepts and philosophies, and if they're not, that's fine, but you've got to be able to answer why did you depart from this guideline?
Right.
For example, we may say we don't send in weapons, and if they do so, that's their decision, but you better be able to say
Right. Why are you doing this?
this is the compelling reason we did that,
Right.
and so forth. So many examples like that.
Yeah. No, but it's been a huge benefit to the negotiation community. And that's where it helps is if you're that agency maybe that doesn't really want to buy into it, you can go to these guidelines and look, hey, look, this is something that came up
Yeah,
nationally with all these, like you said, there's something like 20 something agents,
yeah.
associations involved in. So it's got a little bit of power behind it when, you're trying to make some changes, and it's really helped. And what I think is really interesting, just since I've been in, the amount of new associations that are popping up, and especially the one, I think there's one trying to get up in Virginia now recently, but it's just such a
I
great
saw that.
thing.
Yeah, I think that's right, and and my objective in bringing them all together and helping them move in this direction was for that purpose, to kind of, to the extent we could, nationalize what we do and standardize it to a higher degree. Two of the things I'm most proud of in my career was starting the National Council of Negotiation Associations, and on the international front, there's an international negotiation working group that
Hmm.
the FBI represents the United States and the British and the Germans and the French and so forth. are in that, and it's a very similar thing. They don't have the same guidelines, but they meet on an annual basis to exchange ideas and best practices. There's ways you can impact. The other thing, I don't talk about it very much, but I worked with the Poynter Institute years ago to develop for the Radio and Television News Directors Association guidelines for how the news media should behave in these situations.
Mhm.
And I don't know how accessible or if all reporters understand it, but in the early days of the business, the news media would often unwittingly create a lot of problems for us.
Right, right.
And I try to tell negotiators, you should carry a copy of these guidelines with you. And when you get to the scene, you pass them out and make sure these reporters know that, hey, you don't videotape the SWAT team moving
Right,
around
yeah.
and broadcast that. You don't speculate, well, the armored personnel carriers here, I guess they're getting ready to go in.
Right.
You don't call into the site. And there's many more like that. And I think those things are helpful. It's the Radio and Television News Directors Associations. So
So
it's a
we
good
were
one.
talking about some heavy stuff, but let's just be honest. Sometimes we find ourselves in amusing or funny situations.
Yeah.
Is there any call that kind of stood out? We're like looking back, or maybe during the call, you're like, you know what, this is actually kind of funny, and can't believe we're here at this point in time.
Well, there's one I talk about when I give speeches that usually people find pretty amusing, and it's back in the '90s. I'm with my family on the 4th of July on the Washington Mall, having a picnic before the fireworks, and I get my beeper back when we had beepers goes off, and I call this number. It's in South Carolina, and it's one of my field negotiators heading to an incident happening in Charleston Harbor on the USS Yorktown, a decommissioned aircraft carrier that's now a museum. And there's a guy with a gun there, and he's fired off rounds. And in my state of having had a couple beers and bean and potato salad, whatever, I say, hey, listen, we're probably going to be dealing with a veteran because it's a highly
Right.
symbolic day, highly symbolic venue, and just use your active listening skills, help the police in trying to present themselves as non-aggressive and helpful. Anyway, after I said, when you get there and get more information, call me back. And so sure enough, an hour or so later, I get a beep goes off again, and I call the number, and the guy answers the phone, and I said, is this Mike Duke? Is Mike Duke there? That's the name of my guy. And he said, no, there's no Mike Duke here. And I said, is this the command post? No. Is this the negotiation operations center? No. And then he says to me, who are you again? I said, well, I'm Gary Noesner. I'm the chief negotiator with the FBI. I called from Washington. And the guy says, well, I guess I'm in more trouble than I thought.
Oh, jeez.
And I said, you don't happen to be the guy with the gun, are you? He said, well, yes, I am. As it turned out, the number that they had sent on my beeper to call was to the command post in the souvenir shop on
Gotcha.
on the dock, but he could answer it up in the bridge of the ship.
Mm.
So I ended up talking to this guy, and at one point in time, he put me on hold because he heard a noise, and my beeper had sent me another number, and I called that one, and he answered it again. So I had him on two phones at once. I was eventually able to extricate myself and put him in touch with the local negotiators, and they spent a lot of time. And sure enough, a veteran who had drug and alcohol dependency and didn't feel as he was being given the resources and help he needed, and they spent a lot of time with him, but he surrendered peacefully, and it was worth the time and effort. But it was always, sort of a funny story. Here you are,
Not expecting that.
not expecting to talk to a
Right.
gunman from 400 miles away or something.
Right. So let's talk about new negotiators. What advice would you give a new negotiator, and how would you tell them maybe how to prepare, maybe if they're going through that selection process?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the selection process would vary depending on the agency, but I said, really focus on being a good listener, and if you can learn a little bit about active listening skills, it'll probably serve you well before you even get formally trained in the best application of those. But just be genuine and sincere in wanting to help people, and in a crisis, Pat, I have a presentation I do that lists about 12 attributes that I think make a negotiator successful.
Mm-hmm.
The number one that I've found is likability, plain old
Right.
likability. we all want to work with and engage with people that we like and we think are sincere and genuine and honest. And that's why people came out. And I basically came to that belief because, we would always be in the habit of, at the end of situations, asking the perpetrator, what did we say that made you come out? Because we obviously want to learn and
Right.
from that. And it's interesting that the answer is essentially always the same, and it's that I don't remember what you said, but I liked the way you said it. Well, boy, is there power in that, right? I mean,
Right. Yeah.
it's amazing. It's not so much the individual argument, the persuasive approach you take. It's your tone and your demeanor and your projection of sincerity and just being a good person. You say, hey, Pat, I really hate to see you get hurt in there. I really want to help you get through this. What can we do? How can we work together? It's a voice and an approach that they don't expect from law enforcement, and it's powerful stuff. And it serves us quite well. So I would tell a new negotiator, to think about that. How do you come across to others when you're communicating? Do you project that empathic presence? Do you show you generally want to care? And the other thing I tell people is practice. Uh,
Right. Yeah.
I always jokingly tell audiences about my victim du jour, as I call it, when I'm traveling and speaking, and I'm sitting in a hotel bar and having my
Mm-hmm.
dinner. Whoever sits next to me, young, old, male, female, doesn't matter. I'm going to find out as much as I can about them without offering anything about myself. And it's quite a fun game I play, and I do it sincerely and genuinely. And it's amazing what you learn about people. And
Yeah.
I once met a guy that his hobby was tightrope walking, and I go like, wow, I mean that's a first. And
Yeah.
we became Facebook friends. People that have done some really interesting things in their lives. If you take the time to listen and inquire and ask open-ended questions and all the stuff we do as negotiators, and if you're good at that with a complete stranger, you'll be fine with somebody on the phone when you're negotiating.
Yeah, absolutely. So I always get asked, is how can I prepare? What books are out there? What training should I go to? So I want to steer them to something you just started. It's something fairly new, that Icons of Influence that you, Jack Cambria, and
Yeah,
Andy Briscoe are kind of did. I watched almost all the episodes. I thought it was great. So I want to talk about how that came about and a little bit about
yeah.
that program.
I had been on Andy Prisco, who runs Jumpstart Mastery, mostly focused towards crisis intervention and mental health field, and really great guy, and really quite bright and well informed, and a delight to be with. And so I was a guest on his podcast, and he and I began to have a discussion subsequently about maybe putting together something on negotiations. And I suggested, well, why don't we bring Jack Cambria? Because Jack, known as Gentleman Jack, is
Right. Yeah.
retired from the NYPD, was a long running head of the hostage negotiation team, and a super guy and very experienced. And I said, I think it might be an interesting blend to get someone from the federal side, with our broader national and international
Right.
experience, and then and major sieges. I mean, to be candid, I'm not trying to brag on the FBI, but most police officers are never going to work a week long
Right. Yeah.
prison riot or a
Right.
terrorist siege, hijacking, embassy siege, that kind of thing. So we bring certain, experiences into it that a local negotiator wouldn't. And then Jack, or someone like Jack or yourself, are going to bring in things that we don't typically do in the FBI, more suicides and depressed and so forth. Anyway, I thought it would be interesting to get the two of us, and we're friends, to informally just sit down and talk about some of these things for posterity. I mean,
Mhm.
Jack's younger than me, but how long will I be doing this? I don't know. But so we went out there this last year and taped the series, and I think they came out quite good. And I think people who are serious about negotiations and want to learn some things that you might not hear in a typical class, or viewpoints, perspectives, experiences we've had, I think would greatly benefit from them.
Yeah, and I'll tell you. So I was talking before the show with Gary about it, and I went through and watched probably about 5 episodes, and I'm like, you know what? I didn't even take notes, so I actually stopped, went back, to the first episode, and man, I'm telling you, and not to say, but I've been doing this a long time, and there was so much stuff. I was just like, man, that's good stuff. Just notes upon notes, and it was just something I thought, yeah, if you want to know more about negotiations, definitely.
Well, coming from someone like you, that means a great deal, and I appreciate that perspective.
All right, Gary. So we're going to end on this. So, what do you feel your legacy is in negotiations, and what do you want to leave future negotiators?
Well, it's a good point. I feel, I've been a real advocate for the program because I tell people, if you go to a scene or you're involved in a department, if you wait for the on-scene commander to come ask your opinion, you're going to be like the old commercial with the Maytag repairman. The theme was that their machines were so good that nobody ever called the repairman, and they were lonely.
Right.
And that's how you're going to be as a negotiation coordinator. You have to, be upfront and be sure that, particularly as a negotiation coordinator, team leader, whatever, that you're going to have to, be articulate to explain to decision makers why we should, in reality, practice what we preach, and that is we use no more force than is absolutely necessary, which speaks very strongly advocating the negotiation program. That should be our default. We don't use tactic intervention just because we can. We've got to be able to face the public or court and say the behaviors of this person left us with no other choice than to use force to, apprehend them or whatever, or rescue a hostage. So our default should always be negotiations, but a lot of departments, we're paramilitary organizations, that hasn't necessarily been universally accepted. So the negotiation leader has to be an advocate for that, and I think I've helped further that recommendation. I'm very proud of having. I mentioned the National Council of Negotiation Associations and the International Negotiation Working Group, and I think the biggest contribution I made was when the FBI, made the dramatic shift in 1990 to active listening. Again, a small bit of it had been in our program, but then we made it kind of the core basis skill of everything we did, and put that in instructional materials that were sent to all 56 FBI offices to teach around the country. And I think that's had a dramatic impact in resolving situations peacefully, keeping officers safe. And so I'm very proud of that legacy. Certainly not something I did alone, but it certainly played a important role in that, I feel, and I feel good about that. And there's great negotiators out there now that are going further, farther, higher, better, whatever, and that's good. Great. We all step on the shoulders of the people who came before us, as I did, and we learn and we grow, and so I feel good about what we've learned as negotiators. We still have a battle to wage to make sure that we get the support and that we need for this life-saving work. And I mentioned that one earlier. I would like to see them stop saying negotiations failed. It didn't. It never does.
Absolutely right.
Yeah, but so things like that we still have to fight. But it's been really an honor and a privilege to look back at the many years I've been involved in this now since 1980 and see the growth and the professionalism and the success that negotiations has had across the country. It's whenever you do something that results in lives being saved, that's pretty special.
Absolutely.
And not everybody gets to say that. And you also have to deal with the unfortunate consequence when it doesn't always work out the way we want, and there is a loss of life, and those are tough. But we have to continue to focus on the good work that we do, and its important role in our profession.
Well, Gary, thanks for sharing your legacy with us, and we're going to make sure our listeners get links to all that stuff we talked about, your book, the miniseries, the new Icons of Influence. We're going to make sure we link that up so people can click right on that and get more involved and find out more. But thank you for your time, Gary.
A lot of that's on my website, www.GaryNoesner, all one word, .com, and they can access, podcasts and interviews and links to shows, all that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Gary. We appreciate it.
You're most welcome.